Hey everyone, my name is Nick Wignall. I'm a clinical psychologist and the founder of The Friendly Mind, a free weekly newsletter where I share practical, evidence-based advice for emotional health and well-being. In today's video, we're going to talk about self-esteem, specifically 4 habits that cause low self-esteem. If you struggle with low self-esteem, the most important thing is not to overcomplicate things. For example, you probably don't need to spend decades of your life in psychotherapy digging through the past, looking for things that caused your self-esteem problems. Because, and this is really important, whatever happened in the past to initiate your self-esteem problems, it's your habits in the present that are maintaining them. This means that the most effective way to improve your self-esteem is to find the 1 or 2 things going on in your life right now in the present that are keeping your self-esteem low and work to improve those. I'm going to go through 4 habits that I've seen over the course of my career as a psychologist that show up over and over again with people who struggle with low self-esteem. If you can find these, if you can identify these, if they are going on in your life, you can become more aware of them. And if you're more aware of them, you can work to undo them. And as a result, your self-esteem is very likely to rise significantly. Number 1, dwelling on the past. When you are in the habit of constantly dwelling on mistakes in the past and reminding yourself of what a screw up you are and all the terrible things you've done, you train your brain to think of yourself as a failure. And if your brain starts to learn that you are a failure because you spent all this time thinking about your mistakes and missteps and failures, that means your brain is much more likely to start throwing really unhelpful thoughts at you. Things like negative self-talk, self-criticism, self-doubt, imposter syndrome, all that kind of stuff. And the result of that is you're going to feel increasingly inadequate, like you're lacking confidence, and just generally incompetent to face whatever kind of challenges or difficulties are present in your life. In other words, the cost of living in the past is the inability to live fully in the present. Of course, it's important to reflect on and think about mistakes we've made in the past and hopefully learn from them. But there is a huge difference between healthy reflection on past mistakes and impulsive rumination and dwelling. Okay, really critical. Healthy reflection versus unhealthy rumination. If you struggle with rumination and it's impacting your self-esteem, accept your past failings, learn from them if possible, and then summon the courage to live your life going forward, moving toward the things you actually want. How to get started. So there's this little exercise I call mistakes writing. And I find it really, really helpful for folks who struggle with chronic rumination and dwelling on the past that is interfering with their self-esteem. All you have to do, if you have things in the past that are mistakes or missteps or even injuries, people have hurt you, things like that, but you find yourself dwelling on them and it's impacting your self-esteem. If that's the case for you, here's what I want you to do. Schedule 10 minutes a day. You can do this for at least a couple weeks. Try this for a couple weeks. 10 minutes. It's not that much, right? Schedule 10 minutes per day and get out a notepad, piece of paper, right? Just a little regular old legal pad, something like that. And what I want you to do is briefly, intentionally journal about your mistakes and what you might be able to learn from them. Okay. So for instance, you might ask, what led to those mistakes and how can I avoid similar sort of slippery slopes in the future? That's one good question. Another one is, what has this mistake taught me about my personality and character that I didn't know before? Okay. That's the second question. The third one is, what habits or actions can I initiate now that will make me less likely to fall into similar mistakes in the present or in the future going forward? I'll say those again. What led to those mistakes and how can I avoid similar slippery slopes today? What has this mistake taught me about my personality and character that I didn't know before? And what habits or actions can I initiate now that will make it less likely that I fall into a similar mistake in the future? Okay, so those are 3 really good questions to reflect on in writing during a very specific time in order to process mistakes from the past in a healthy and productive way. Now, the key is outside of your 10 minutes of mistakes writing, you need to refuse, and I mean that literally, you need to refuse to allow yourself to think about those mistakes. When they pop up, when memories of some mistake happened in the past, you want to gently acknowledge those thoughts or memories and then remind yourself, I have a time to think about those. And so right now, I'm going to refocus my attention on something else, something that matters, something important to me. And you're going to let those thoughts and memories go. no matter how sort of emotionally uncomfortable they may be. So you're essentially taking a rain check on thinking about the past because you have this habit and your brain can trust you. You have this habit when you are deliberately and intentionally reflecting on mistakes and trying to learn from them. So the goal here, remember the goal of this exercise, is to train yourself to be better able to let go of those unhelpful thoughts when they pop up about the past and mistakes you've made. Stop thinking about them impulsively. And you're going to be better able to do that because you've carved out time to think about and process those things intentionally. Number 2, mood criticism. Now, it's pretty ironic, I think, if you stop and think about this, that a lot of the most kind and compassionate people in the world, at least in my experience, are incredibly judgmental and self-critical of themselves. And a specific instance of this is how they deal with their own bad moods, right? So if a friend came to you, let's say, and they were in a bad mood, they were having a hard time, they were struggling with some anxiety, say, or guilt about something. Think about it. How would you respond to a good friend like that, who is struggling emotionally like that? Undoubtedly, I have no doubt you would be compassionate, you would be supportive, you would be gentle, you would be understanding. But the minute you find yourself in a bad mood, guess who shows up? It's not the kind, compassionate, supportive one. It's the mean, critical, sort of judgmental voice that's pointing out your flaws and what you should have done and how you could have handled this better and why you're weak and blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. All of this you would never do to someone else, but you do it to yourself constantly, especially when you feel bad emotionally, when you're in a bad mood of any sort of variety, whether it's nervous or irritable or sad or anxious or whatever the case may be. But here's the thing. Feeling bad is hard enough without feeling bad about feeling bad. And when you're in the habit of judging yourself for your bad moods, you end up feeling bad about feeling bad. This is what I call compounding emotions. And when you compound emotions, this is a recipe for long-term suffering and artificially low self-esteem. So the next time you find yourself in a bad mood, even a very minor, relatively small bad mood, try a little self-compassion rather than self-judgment. It's going to feel unnatural at first, but that's okay. All new habits feel unnatural. The point is, create a little space when you're feeling bad, and instead of jumping right to self-criticism and self-judgment, try a little bit of self-compassion. And the nice thing is, it's a skill you already have because you apply it to everyone else in your life. You just don't tend to apply it to yourself. So it's really just a memory thing. It's about being mindful and remembering to apply compassion to yourself when you have a bad mood instead of judgment and criticism. How to get started. So I find the following little mantra really helpful for remembering to be compassionate with myself rather than self-critical. And it goes like this. Just because it feels bad doesn't mean it is bad. Emotions can often feel very, very bad, right? Anxiety, sadness, shame, irritability, stuff like that. But no matter how bad they feel, they aren't actually bad. There's nothing wrong with you for feeling those emotions. And it's really key, even if you understand that intellectually, to remind yourself of that. That's why this little mantra or memory device is so helpful. Just because it feels bad doesn't mean it is bad. So anytime you notice sort of a downward shift in mood, again, even a relatively minor one, you want to pull out this little mantra and remind yourself that just because it feels bad doesn't mean it is bad. It's okay to feel bad. Now, tactically, the most important thing about using this mantra is that you don't save it just for really big bad moods, times when you're overwhelmed emotionally. And instead, you actually want to pull it out and use it in times when you don't necessarily need it. So very small, minor shifts in mood, a tiny little bit of annoyance, or a minor little blip of anxiety. These are actually perfect times to use this because it allows you to internalize this practice and get used to it. And the more you get used to it and practice it, the easier it will be to use it in big situations where you really need it. And therefore, the more effective it will be in helping you deal with difficult moods and emotions in a healthy way. And instead of falling into all that self-esteem killing self-criticism and self-judgment, it will allow you to be self-compassionate, which is very promoting of good, solid, healthy self-esteem. Number 3, acting defensive. Now, we all get defensive sometimes. It's perfectly normal. If you have been sort of unfairly criticized or even fairly criticized or hurt or judged or disrespected or anything like that, really, it's totally normal to have an emotional reaction that we all typically call defensiveness. It's usually some sort of mixture of anger, sadness, shame or guilt, maybe a little bit of anxiety, something like that. But we feel bad after being criticized. That's the gist of it. But here's the thing. There is a huge difference between feeling defensive and acting defensive. Feeling defensive versus acting defensive. If you feel attacked, criticized, judged, all that kind of stuff, the impulse a lot of us feel, in addition to feeling hurt, feeling defensive, we have this impulse to attack back. We counter their criticism with our own biting bit of sarcasm, say, or we respond to their disrespect with a criticism of them of our own. But even though it's totally natural to act defensively when you're criticized, it tends to be really unhelpful long-term for your self-esteem. Here's why. If you have low self-esteem, chances are you're always on the lookout to feel a little bit better. Because if you have low self-esteem, you're probably chronically feeling sort of bad about yourself. Not literally all the time, but a lot of the time. So it just makes sense that you're even kind of unconsciously looking for opportunities to feel better about yourself. And when you act defensively, when you criticize someone else, temporarily, very temporarily, it's an ego boost. Because when you're saying something bad about someone else, you're implying something good about them, about you. Because when you say something bad about someone else, you're implying something good about yourself. Right? When you criticize someone else for being dumb or stupid, you're implying that you're smart. When you judge someone else for being bad or morally wrong, you're implying that you are good or morally right. And very briefly, that feels good. It's an ego boost. In the very short term, right? We feel a little bit better. However, this is a very poor substitute for authentic self-esteem. Because if you think about it, what are the long-term consequences of acting out your defensiveness? Well, it usually leads to more conflict and resentment and sort of friction and distance between you and other people. Over time, you also start to feel guilty and ashamed about acting out your defensiveness, because the vast majority of us, no matter how self-righteous we feel in the moment, we know that acting out our defensiveness is rarely the right thing to do. It's usually the wrong thing to do. And like at our core, we basically know that. So we end up feeling bad about ourselves, which just reinforces our difficulty with low self-esteem, our struggles with self-esteem. So better to accept your defensiveness and act on your values rather than acting on your defensiveness and reinforcing your low self-esteem. How to get started. Most people have patterns of defensiveness. That is, there are certain situations which tend to reliably provoke defensiveness, both the feeling and the response. Now, the upside of this is that because defensiveness is fairly predictable, not all the time, of course, but more often than not, actually, it's pretty predictable, the types of situations or the people who tend to provoke defensiveness. Because of that, you can get much better at anticipating getting defensive and therefore preparing for it well. So try this. Go make a cup of coffee or tea and sit down for 15 or 20 minutes, get a blank piece of paper. Again, remember, all you need, a little notepad. And all I want you to do is jot down as many situations as you can think of where you've gotten defensive, either felt defensive or felt and acted defensive over the last few weeks. So just take a few minutes and think back to when you've been defensive. It could be longer than that. It could be months if you wanted, whatever. Just make a list of situations that tend to lead to defensiveness in you. Then scan your list. Once you've done this, scan your list and identify just the one or two, maybe three most common situations. Okay, just circle them or whatever. Then, in advance of these situations, what I want you to do is to schedule, and yes, I literally mean put a reminder in your phone, put a calendar event in your calendar on your phone with an alarm and a reminder. So if you tend to get defensive with, your colleague, Bob, who shows up in the monthly sales meeting on the second Wednesday of every month at 12 p.m., great. So set an alarm for 11:30 on the second Wednesday of every month that goes off, and it's called defensiveness prep or something like that. Then what I want you to do is when that alarm goes off, just take 5 minutes and anticipate what might happen to lead you to feel defensive. If that happens, anticipate how you're going to feel. Okay, I'm going to feel hurt, feel defensive. I'm going to feel, anxious, maybe a little bit angry, and I'm going to want to criticize back. I know I'm going to want to do that. So you're playing all this out in your head. Then this is the most important part. Think about how you want to act ideally. What's the best possible reaction for you if you are to be criticized? In a perfect world, how would you react? And spend just a minute or two kind of writing down some ideas for what that would be. Now, the reason this works really well is because all emotions, including feeling defensive,
they are amplified by surprise. They get if you're angry, but you get angry by surprise, or if you're anxious but you're surprised about getting anxious, those emotions get way, way bigger. So similarly, when you're caught off guard by defensiveness, it tends to get bigger and is therefore harder to handle. But by doing this little exercise of sort of inventorying and then anticipating moments of defensiveness, you can eliminate the element of surprise, and therefore your overall amount of defensiveness is going to be dramatically less, which means you're going to be much better able to manage it in a healthy way. And when you start dealing with criticism and judgment and defensiveness in a healthy and productive way, instead of acting defensive, you will be amazed at what happens to your self-esteem. Number 4, happiness hacking. Now, everybody likes feeling happy, right? Who doesn't like feeling happy? It feels great. However, it's a profound mistake to assume that we should always feel happy or strive and aspire to always be happy. And the reason for this is pretty straightforward. Feeling bad, while awful and uncomfortable and painful even sometimes, it is a totally normal and often useful part of the human experience. Sadness, anger, shame, fear, regret, all of this stuff, right? It's totally normal and potentially even helpful sometimes, despite being really uncomfortable. I know it sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but it's surprising how often our actions suggest that's not what we really believe. You might not like these feelings, but that has nothing to do with whether they are good or bad. But if you get yourself caught up in this habit of constantly trying to make yourself happy, the consequence is you tend to invalidate those difficult, painful emotions. Notice I didn't say negative emotions. They're not negative because they're not bad. They're just difficult. They're uncomfortable. They're painful. And when you're in the habit of invalidating those difficult emotions, you end up actually feeling even more miserable and unhappy. And all that leads to this pretty gnarly vicious cycle, which has really negative detrimental effects on your self-esteem. So happiness hacking, or forcing yourself to feel happier than you actually should, is a great way to end up feeling a whole lot worse than you should. On the other hand, when you get in the habit of acknowledging and validating difficult emotions and ultimately allowing them to be there, tough as that is in the short term, it leads to a lot of emotional strength and confidence. And eventually, that emotional strength and confidence leads to much higher levels of emotional resilience, which in turn, on average, tends to increase your overall level of happiness. So remember, it's not about feeling good or bad. It's about having a healthy relationship with whatever you're feeling. How to get started? What you want to do is get in the habit of normalizing unhappiness. When you feel unhappy, take a brief second. This is very brief, 5 seconds. Really, that's it. And just remind yourself that however uncomfortable, it's normal and even okay to feel happy sometimes. You can get on with your life. You can do important, meaningful things while feeling unhappy. And there's this nice little phrase that I use a lot to help remind you of this. And it is, even though I wish I didn't feel unhappy right now, it makes sense that I do because blank. And then you got to fill in the blank there. So for example, even though I wish I didn't feel unhappy right now, it makes sense that I do because my coworker was late for the meeting again. Or even though I wish I didn't feel unhappy right now, it makes sense that I do because I'm still grieving for the loss of my parent and I feel sad, and that's a part of grief. Now, once you've briefly normalized and validated that bit of unhappiness, whatever sort of emotional flavor it had, anger, sadness, anxiety, shame, then you want to refocus your attention on whatever's important to you in the moment, whatever's meaningful or productive right now. Improving your self-esteem is a lot more straightforward than most people realize. Of course, that doesn't mean it's easy, but you're not doing yourself any favors by convincing yourself that your self-esteem struggles are more complex than they actually are. Try to identify the 1 or 2 main drivers of your low self-esteem, habits in the present that are suppressing your self-esteem, and work hard to address those in a healthy and productive way. And in my experience, 4 of the most common habits that tend to suppress our self-esteem and keep it artificially low include the 4 things we talked about: dwelling on the past, mood criticism, acting defensive, and happiness hacking. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to learn more from me about ways to build healthy self-esteem and other aspects of emotional health, I write a free weekly newsletter called The Friendly Mind. I send it out every Monday morning. It's full of lots of tips, ideas, my newest articles, essays, stuff like that. And I would love for you to join our community. So you can sign up using the link in the description below. And once again, thank you for watching.